You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion. The British government plans to make all publicly funded research open access by 2014. The plans would mean that scientific research would become freely available online for universities, companies, and members of the public. Proponents say it's the most radical shake-up of academic publishing since the internet was invented. Under the scheme, taxpayer-funded research would be available online. But critics question how the move will be funded. If it falls to the authors of the research, how will they or their universities be able to afford it? Well, joining me for today's discussion is Ross Mounts, Panton Fellow from the Open Knowledge Foundation. Rita Gardner is the Director of the Royal Geographical Society. And joining us over the phone is Bjorn Brems, Professor at the Department of Genetics at the University of Leipzig. And Timothy Gowers is a maths professor at Cambridge University. We'll start with you, Ross. Is this a good idea?
It's a great idea. All authors of research want to make their research freely available to everyone. That's everyone's desire. And it's only the publishing companies that want to restrict access to research in order to gain profit. So from the researcher side of things, everyone's really happy about this.
Rita Gardner, Director of the Royal Geographical Society.
The Learned Society perspective, and I can't speak for all learned societies, I can just speak for ours, of course, is quite a complicated one because we're charities, we exist for the public good, so we like to see people having access and open access to research. Because we support the academic community, we recognise that some academics are very pro open access, others are very concerned about restrictions on what they might be able to publish where and when. And because, of course, as learned societies, we do generate some surpluses from our publishing, not, I would say, of the order of the big publishing companies, modest surpluses, but we plough those back as not-for-profit organisations into supporting our communities and our disciplines as charities. So it's a rather complex matter for us.
Timothy Gowers, Professor at Cambridge University.
I am very much in favour of open access. I think it's all the arguments about taxpayers having funded the research, therefore having the right to read the research without restrictions. I agree with those. But I'm also very concerned about the cost of the current model. It seems that now that we have the internet for disseminating our research, there should be a much better model for how we go about things. And so that's where my interests arose, really.
And Bjorn Brems, Professor at the Department of Genetics at the University of Leipzig.
Yes, open access is, of course, very much a good thing for the public in particular, but, of course, especially for the researchers who need access to the literature. And I appreciate, of course, that the learned societies do generate some revenue via the publishing system, so they're definitely a special case or a special obstacle that one would have to think about finding proper solutions for. But as that special case, I think they should not distract from the larger opportunities and important tasks to bring access to everyone.
Rita Gardner, you said that societies like yours exist for the public good. If all this research is publicly funded, the ones that's going to be open access, why shouldn't the public have free access to it?
I'm not arguing that the public shouldn't have free access. I too support open access as a concept. But actually there is a cost to open access. That cost may change as the internet and so on and develops, and some of the people around the table may have views on that. But at present, there are costs associated. It's open access, free access doesn't mean at no cost in the sense of to produce peer-reviewed articles. If we want to continue to have peer-reviewed articles, if we want to continue to have archiving, if we want to continue to have leading journals as something that the academic community value publishing in, if we see those as important aspects of the mechanisms and the delivery, some people might argue they're not, but certainly in the medium term, they will continue to be important aspects of the delivery, then there is a cost to doing that, to make that free at the point of access. And our concerns are, where are those costs actually going to be met? And how are publishers like ourselves going to find a business model that works in this new open access world?
Ross Mounts, there's rumours that it could cost at least £50 million a year to fund some of these possible routes, the gold or the green model, which we'll get onto later. How on earth can publishers like Reader's survive?
A lot of people actually dispute those costs and think they're rather exaggerated. It's based upon an assumption that it'll be more expensive than many people think it will actually be. I mean, if you think about it, to put a PDF up on the internet and let people download it, that doesn't actually cost that much money.
But Rita would say it's all the background charges. Of course, it doesn't cost anyone to download it.
Background what? To make a PDF? I as a scientific author, create a work. I add my images to it. I write the words. I submit it to a journal, and the journal publishes it on a website for everyone to download. Now, there's bandwidth costs. There's costs of maintaining the website. It actually costs more to maintain the paywalls to restrict people from accessing that PDF under the current model than it would under an open access model to just let anyone in the world download that piece of research.
Timothy Gowers, professor at Cambridge University. Even the university's minister, David Willits, has accepted there's going to be this transitional cost to go through if we were going to go to these other models. But this £50 million a year, or even if it was less, which are some of the numbers being accepted by other people, how on earth could it allow for the survival of other journals and publishers?
Well, ultimately, I hope this is very much a transitional cost and quite a short transition. So I don't mind seeing some journals go to the wall if they refuse to, if they insist on sticking to the subscription model, because ultimately they'll be replaced by other journals. And the total cost, if all journals switch tomorrow to even to a fairly expensive gold open access model, would be much less than the total cost of the current subscription model. So if my understanding is correct, this 50 or 60 million is on the assumption that the subscription journals carry on existing as subscription journals, and open access journals are a sort of add-on to the existing system. But if once the open access actually starts to replace subscriptions rather than adding to them, then there'll be huge savings of money. So I agree that the 50 million and 60 million estimate is not necessarily correct. But even if it is correct, I think it would be worth paying those transitional costs just from a financial grounds for the sake of the huge savings that would follow a little bit further down the line.
Sure. Rita Garden, let's bring you in here.
Yes, I mean, I think the modelling that was done for the Finch report and so on, which came up with those figures, suggested they were fairly robust figures, although there's a lot of uncertainties actually involved within that, and it is for a transition period. Once we all reach a whole open access world, it'll be a very different scenario, as has just been said. But we don't know how long that transition period is going to be, and we don't know how deep that transition period is going to be. We don't know the rate at which people in the rest of the world are going to follow suit, and the extent to which they're going to follow suit. So I think the transition period is one of many unknowns, and the issue about implementing the Finch report recommendations is the fact that the devil is in the detail. There are and that's one of the issues that faces the learning societies. There are unknowns about, whether the money is going to be available for gold, how that's going to be managed in institutions, what the length of the green embargoes are going to be. And in that setting of a lot of unknowns, it makes planning for organisations such as the learning societies actually particularly difficult.
Bjorn Brems, let's bring you in here, Professor at the Department of Genetics at University of Leipzig. What are your thoughts about what you've just heard from Rita?
I would actually say that, to the contrary, I'd take the first point about transitional costs. I would actually say that these transitional costs and the modeling of them, of course, makes a lot of sense when one considers the grown, traditional, so to say, infrastructure that we have. However, one should really think about whether it's worth keeping, let's say, the Telegraph or the Pony Express going when there's better alternatives. And the current publishing model using commercial publishers is just the equivalent of the Telegraph or the Pony Express. So if one takes an international perspective and not just a UK or European-centric perspective, then, and that depends a little bit on the numbers and the sources for those numbers, but there's roughly about a $15 billion or euro roughly a year market in academic publishing. and out of which there are about $4 billion in profit by corporate publishers. And so I think, and that those roughly 15 billions are being paid to a large extent, not entirely, of course, but to a large extent on the order of 80%. By public libraries, by university libraries, institutions, and other organizations like that. So in principle, and those libraries, of course, have pretty much the exact same capabilities that the publishers have in terms of archiving, storage, and making the works accessible. So if one would just cut out the middleman, as the publishers are, and simply had the institutional libraries perform that, the libraries would have worldwide those 15 billion at their disposal to publish to publish the works. And the costs, of course, there are costs to publish this, and those are the remaining 10 to 11 billion out of those 15, if one assumes that those numbers are correct for a moment, or at least in the ballpark, in the correct ballpark. So I would say that there's hardly any transitional costs. I would actually say that one could probably just free up about maybe half of the corporate publishers' profits of about 2 billion worldwide every year, and still have a fairly stable transition until the remaining 2 billion would be able to be freed up.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion. Joining me in the studio is Ross Mounts, Panton Fellow from the Open Knowledge Foundation, and Rita Gardner, Director of the Royal Geographical Society. Joining us over the phone is Bjorn Brems, Professor at the Department of Genetics at the University of Leipzig, and Timothy Gowers is a Maths Professor at Cambridge University. Rita, if we go to you, we're going to outline these two models now. Could you begin with the gold model?
The gold model is a model where there's an article payment charge, where basically the author or the author's institution, or however that's funded, pays the publisher, in this instance, to publish that article. And that then article is then freely available immediately after it's been peer-reviewed and accepted for publication. It's made freely available on the publisher's website, on repositories, or whichever mechanisms that sort of journal is actually operating. So that's the gold route. It's an author pays route.
A good model or a bad model for the future of journals?
Well, it is one of the models in which open access can be delivered. This is a model in which there is still a publishing function recognised as being important. So there's a function that actually ensures that when you do a Google search, for example, the articles you want come up on the front page. You're not several sort of pages down in Google trying to search out the particular article that you want. So it just depends whether people feel there is a purpose and a function to the value added that publishers bring. And it's a perfectly legitimate argument, as we've heard around the table, to say that there is no value to that. You may as well put the material up on the internet, have a good search function and make it available. There are others who argue that actually the publishers do provide added value services that are sought after and will continue to be sought after. It's two different legitimate points of view, and it's a great shame. I'm not sitting here to argue as a publisher. I'm a learned society. I represent a learned society. A small part of what we do in general is publishing, but it's very important to us.
Ross Mounts, let's bring you in here. Is this all the gold model all about ensuring that we ensure the financial security of journal publishers? Do you accept that they do have this added value?
There are certain things that publishers can do to create added value on top of author-supplied work. For example, they can provide an XML version of the article, which enables it to be more easily text-mined for computer science research and synthesizing data across hundreds of thousands or millions of different papers. That's a really exciting and interesting area of research that I'm involved in at the moment. And publishers can enrich articles by making innovative 3D figures available, things like that. That there are things publishers can do. But on the whole, from what I see of publisher websites like Elsevier, like Wiley, like those publishers, all they do is basically put the PDF up and provide a DOI so you can find it. I genuinely can't see much that they do, aside from organising peer review or a few other things. They don't really do all that much, and I don't see how they deserve to make £1 million per year per library across the world. It's incredible.
Obviously, some people will see some value in what they do and believe they do a lot more than what Ross thinks. But Rita, you want to come in here?
I was just going to come in here and say some of the changes that we're seeing will actually, I'm sure, engender responses in the publishers. And some of those responses may, in fact, be to look at ways of adding value and may be very positive. I think what's happened here is very timely. You've had a range of stakeholders through the Finch Review coming together, having to, for the first time, sit around a table and discuss the issues and try and find a way forward that works for them all. It's been an interesting process.
Bjorn Brems, obviously with the APCs, the authors paying basically to have their articles published, doesn't this raise questions for maybe some young scientists who can't quite afford to pay those fees? Some people suggesting they could be as low as £2,000 or it could be even higher.
So most article processing charges, the APCs, are definitely lower than £2,000. Clearly, for younger or less well-off or researchers in developing countries, this would be an issue. However, most publishers that I know either provide waivers for developing countries, or for anybody who is not able to pay, no questions asked. And so this really is not necessarily a big problem. It's just the more well-off labs and researchers are compensating and are being overcharged, if you want, to accommodate the less well-off researchers.
Timothy Gowers, professor at Cambridge University. Many argue that the web has made publishers unnecessary at the moment. Is this just the journal publishers trying to protect themselves, or is there a greater value in what they do?
Well, I think it's possible to think of quite good and interesting sounding models for publishing that would not involve, for dissemination and review of articles that would not resemble very closely the existing models of journals and editors and referees and so on. But I think there'd be quite a problem in getting those accepted quickly. I mean, there may be websites that get set up and review sites, for example. People talk about post-publication review sites, which I think is a very interesting idea, but I think if you just set one up, it's not going to require the sort of reputation that will enable people to submit their papers to it instead of to a conventional journal for quite a long time.
But some argue, why should academic authors pay anything at all? Some should be paid for their articles instead of paying to have them published.
Maybe I could just mention I'm involved in a recently launched, although it hasn't yet started accepting articles, a recently launched open access journal for Cambridge University Press. And one thing to say there is that their article processing charge is going to be more like £500 rather than £2,000, and that's a major publisher, so that shows that can be done. And secondly, they have exactly the rules that Bjorn was talking about. People from there's a list of developing countries from which people will not be required to pay a charge, and nobody will be required to pay a charge. No author will be expected to pay out of their own pocket. They will only have to pay if they've got some institutional backup, some institutional system set up that will cover the charges. So I think to call it an author pays model, it conjures up images of people paying out of their own pocket, but that's definitely not the kind of model that people are really thinking of when they talk about gold open access. It's institutions paying on behalf of authors. So I think that if that can come in, we'll have something that will be sufficiently close to the existing model of journals to be well accepted, and then maybe we'll move a bit later on into more innovative types of models that don't resemble current publishing models at all. Rita Gardner, you wanted to come in?
Yes, I think I really do agree with that, and that we're going to be seeing broadly a style of the published journal model in one form or another, whether it's published online or in hard copy, for some years to come. I think there are a range, though. This is not one size fits all. Some of the online journals that exist at the moment do have low APC charges. They tend to do, not always, but often a more light touch peer review. Some of the other journals, the hybrid journals, where you have a subscription journal that offers a gold route of access, Some of those, particularly where they have very high rejection rates of papers, so some of the leading journals at the moment, their costs for APC, genuine costs, tend to be higher because of the extra amount of work involved. So I think we will see a range of APC charges from the very affordable to the a higher level.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion. Joining me in the studio is Ross Mounts, Panton Fellow from the Open Knowledge Foundation, and Rita Gardner, Director of the Royal Geographical Society. Joining us over the phone is Bjorn Brems, Professor at the Department of Genetics at the University of Leipzig, and Timothy Gowers is a Maths Professor at Cambridge University. Ross Mounts, we're going to go on to the green open access approach. Could you just outline that?
So I believe green open access is where you can post a preprint of your paper up on pretty much any website you choose, or an institutional repository, or a third-party repository like academia.edu or researchgate.net. And it's a great way of getting your research out there, perhaps before the peer review process, to get your peers to read your article and make comments on it before you submit it for publication in the peer review process. Alternatively, you can also deposit your manuscript after the peer review process in the actual final version. And so it's a good way of making a free copy available for everyone to see.
Bjorn Brems, is this a better approach for academics?
I think both the gold and the green standard are transitional, or would be considered, at least for now, transitional ways of making it accessible. And clearly the gold open access road is one that is favored by publishers, because that would be a favorable and sustainable business model for them, while the green road would be more threatening to them. And I think this is very interesting with regards to your question initially, or the discussion point initially, about added value, is that the resistance of publishers is most strongly towards the green road of open access, because there you would get a free access to the version, basically without the added value of the publisher. And the fact that the strongest resistance from the publisher to the green road, it seems to indicate that the publishers don't seem to see that they, or believe themselves that they add any value to it, because if readers had the choice between one version for free without their added value and one version where they can charge with their added value, if that would be a free choice and they would be confident in their added value, they would have no problems with the green open access road.
Rita Gardner, this could be fatal for publishers and learner societies like yours.
Well, let's just clarify. Many publishers, and as I understand it, and certainly many learned societies, already enable a pre-publication paper to be put up online in a repository by the author currently, under their current arrangements. So what we're talking about with green open access, beyond that, is access to the final version of publication of the paper. And the green route is basically one whereby there's an embargo period on a subscription journal at the moment. So there's an embargo period of 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, sometimes 3 years, it varies, between that the paper being published in the journal and it then being free to access in its final version, or a later edited version, some time afterwards. So,
and is there a concern with this embargo?
There is a concern with the embargo if you are looking at a transition period in terms of the transition to open access. It depends how long the embargo is. If we want to sustain our journals, and if we want to make enough money to cover the costs of their production and all the things that are associated with those, we have to get that money from somewhere. If the embargo is at too short a period before access to that final version, then all of the subscriptions will probably, or a large part of the subscriptions may well fall away. So there's no business case for that journal, that publication. Even if you're just trying to cover your own costs, it will be difficult to do that. So I think there is a lot of concern at the moment in terms of sustaining the journal publishing model. Whether you think that's good or bad is another matter. But in terms of sustaining that, there's real concern about the length of those embargo periods. At the moment, they're talking about 6 months embargo for science and about a 12-month embargo for humanities and social sciences.
Timothy Gowers, with this green model, we could possibly see the death of the publishers and the learned societies, couldn't we?
I do think that certainly in maths, which is my subject, if all authors were to make full use of the rights they have now, which in most cases means they can post a final version, a version after referees' comments have been taken into account on any repository they want. Even the commercial publishers, many of them allow that. The only thing that I think keeps those, and what's more, there's no embargo period in many maths journals. So the only thing that keeps the subscription model going is, I think, that not all authors comply with this. They don't bother to put their papers on the repositories. But with the coming of the mandates from research councils, which may be repeated in other countries in the world, then the compliance will presumably go up, and that could be a genuine threat to maths journals. Maths journals that operate under a subscription model. So I think, in a way, you might say that the situation in maths is that if green open access takes off, it'll force journals to become gold open access. You see what I mean?
Sure.
Let's bring a journal that has an article processing charge, then it becomes sustainable, and it doesn't mind. There's no problem if an author puts a paper on some other repository because they've already paid for the article to be published. So that, from the mathematical perspective, I would see, as Bjorn says, I would see green open access also as transitional, but it's sort of, the effect it has is to force journals to move from a subscription model towards something more like an article processing charge.
Ross Mounts from the Open Knowledge Foundation. The UK publishes about 6% of global research. But although we might go to this green model, the rest of the research from around the world will still be behind a paywall. So UK academics will still have to pay for a subscription.
That's not actually true, because the European Union also has an open access mandate now and is trying to make all European Union research open access by 2016. South America already publishes most of its research open access. There's been an open access bill gone through Argentinian parliament already. It's really only the US and China that we need to get on board. So
Rita Gardner, is it just the US and China we've got to get on board?
I think it's a little more complicated than that in some countries, which is what we're talking about here is publicly funded research. A lot of research in some parts of the world is not publicly funded, it's privately funded. That includes in USA, or it's state funded as opposed to national government funded. So in the States at the moment, the mandates that they're looking at relate to potentially to nationally publicly funded research. So it is a very complex picture. Clearly, the biggest research producers in the world are the states. And increasingly, we're going to see China playing a bigger and bigger role. So they're the two big players in the market. And that's why I think the transition period is going to take really quite a long time.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but thank you very much to all of my guests. Joining me for today's discussion was Ross Mounts, Panton Fellow from the Open Knowledge Foundation. Rita Gardner is the Director of the Royal Geographical Society. And joining us over the phone is Bjorn Brems, Professor at the Department of Genetics at the University of Leipzig, and Timothy Gowers is a Maths Professor at Cambridge University. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion. The British government plans to make all publicly funded research open access by 2014. The plans would mean that scientific research would become freely available online for universities, companies, and members of the public. Proponents say it's the most radical shake-up of academic publishing since the internet was invented. Under the scheme, taxpayer-funded research would be available online. But critics question how the move will be funded. If it falls to the authors of the research, how will they or their universities be able to afford it? Well, joining me for today's discussion is Ross Mounts, Panton Fellow. And so on and develops, and some of the people around the table may have views on that. But at present, there are costs associated. It's open access, free access doesn't mean at no cost in the sense of to produce
peer-reviewed articles, if we want to continue to have peer-reviewed articles, if we want to continue to have archiving, if we want to continue to have leading journals as something that the academic community value publishing in, if we see those as important aspects of the mechanisms and the delivery, some people might argue they're not, but certainly in the medium term, they will continue to be important aspects of the delivery, then there is a cost to doing that, to make that free at the point of access. And our concerns are, where are those costs actually going to be met? And how are publishers like ourselves going to find a business model that works in this new open access world?
Ross Mounts, there's rumours that it could come from the Open Knowledge Foundation. Rita Gardner is the director of the Royal Geographical Society, and joining us over the phone is Bjorn Brems, professor at the Department of Genetics at the University of Leipzig, and Timothy Gowers is a maths professor at Cambridge University. We'll start with you, Ross. Is this a good idea?
It's a great idea. All authors of research want to make their research freely available to everyone. That's everyone's desire. And it's only the publishing companies that want to restrict access to research in order to gain profit. So from the researcher side of things, everyone's really happy about this.
Rita Gardner, director of the Royal Geographical Society.
The Learned Society perspective, and I can't speak for all learned societies, I can just speak for ours, of course, is quite a complicated one. Because we're charities, we exist for the public good, so we like to see people having access and open access to research. Because we support the academic...
arose, really.
And Bjorn Brems, professor at the Department of Genetics at the University of Leipzig.
Yes, open access is, of course, very much a good thing. For the public in particular, but of course especially for the researchers who need access to the literature. And I appreciate, of course, that the learned societies do generate some revenue via the publishing system, so they're definitely a special case or a special obstacle that one would have to think about finding proper solutions for. But as that special case, I think they should not distract from the larger opportunities and important tasks to bring access to everyone.
Rita Gardner, you said that societies like yours exist for the public good. If all this research is publicly funded, the ones that's going to be open access, why shouldn't the public have free access to it?
I'm not arguing that the public shouldn't have free access. I too support open access as a concept. But actually there is a cost to open access. That cost may change as the internet and community. We recognise that some academics are very pro open access. Others are very concerned about restrictions on what they might be able to publish where and when. And because, of course, as learned societies, we do generate some surpluses from our publishing, not, I would say, of the order of the big publishing companies, modest surpluses, but we plough those back as not-for-profit organisations into supporting our communities and our disciplines as charities. So it's a rather complex matter for us.
Timothy Gowers, professor at Cambridge University.
I am very much in favour of open access. I think it's all the arguments about taxpayers having funded the research, therefore having the right to read the research without restrictions. I agree with those. But I'm also very concerned about the cost of the current model. It seems that now that we have the internet for disseminating our research, there should be a much better model for how we go about things. And so that's where my interests